The world feels different when you're caring for someone with Alzheimer's. It's not just the disease, it's the small, quiet moments that weigh the heaviest. The mornings when you wake up hoping it'll be a good day. The evenings when you sit beside them, listening to a story they've told 100 times but pretending it's the first. You cling to these fragments of who they were because deep down, you know they're slipping away. It started so slowly. At first, it was just little things: misplaced keys, forgotten appointments. Things anyone could chalk up to a busy mind or old age. But then came the day when everything changed. A phone call, a confused voice on the other end asking for directions home. From a place they'd lived for decades. That's when the gravity of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just forgetfulness. It was something far worse. There's a strange kind of denial that comes with the early days of Alzheimer's. You tell yourself it's just a phase, that things will improve with time, maybe even with the right medication. But deep down, the truth is impossible to ignore. You see it in their eyes, a flicker of confusion, a fleeting moment of panic when they realize they can't find the right words or recognize familiar faces. And as much as you try to hide it, your heart breaks a little more each time. Caring for someone you love with Alzheimer's isn't just about keeping them safe. It's about holding on to the memories they can't anymore. It's about becoming their anchor when they're drifting away, even if it means losing pieces of yourself in the process. But how do you prepare for the moment when the person who raised you, the person who taught you how to tie your shoes and comforted you through heartbreaks, looks at you like a stranger? One morning, the reality of this hit harder than ever. Breakfast was ready, the smell of toast and coffee filling the kitchen. It was the same routine every day, keeping things familiar, predictable, safe. But that day, something was different. The blank expression on their face when they walked into the room was like a dagger to the chest. They paused, looked around, and then asked, "Where am I? Who are you?" The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. For a moment, you don't know what to say. You want to scream, cry, and shake them back into the person you remember. Instead, you smile, force your voice to stay steady, and say, "It's me. I'm here." But inside, you're crumbling. Each day becomes a test of patience, strength, and love. There are moments of lucidity, precious, fleeting seconds when they seem like themselves again. They'll laugh at a joke, hum a tune from their youth, or suddenly recall a memory from years ago as if it just happened yesterday. And for those brief moments, your heart soars. You let yourself believe that maybe, just maybe, things aren't as bad as they seem. But then reality hits. It comes in the form of forgotten names, misplaced objects, or the heartbreak of watching them grow agitated over something they can't understand. You try to stay calm, to remind yourself it's not their fault. But it's hard. So hard. And some nights, when the house is quiet, you let yourself cry. Not because you're angry or resentful, but because you miss them. Even though they're still here, you miss them. The hardest part isn't the caregiving, it's the grief. It's the slow, relentless mourning of someone who's still alive. It's realizing that the person you love is fading, piece by piece, day by day, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. You can't fix it, can't bring them back, can't even hold on to the memories they've forgotten. But you try. You hold their hand when they're scared. You laugh with them when they remember something funny. You tell them stories from their past, hoping it'll spark something, anything, even if it's just a flicker of recognition. And when they don't respond, you keep going. Because deep down, you know that somewhere inside, they can feel your love, even if they can't say it back. Then there are the days that shake you to your core. Like the time they wandered out the door, convinced they were late for work, a job they retired from decades ago. The panic that courses through you as you search for them, the relief when you finally find them safe, and the crushing guilt that follows. You wonder if you're doing enough, if you're strong enough, if you're failing them somehow. And yet, through all the heartbreak, there's a kind of beauty in it. A quiet, unspoken bond that words can't capture. It's in the way they still light up when they see an old photograph, even if they don't remember the people in it. It's in the way they squeeze your hand a little tighter when they're feeling lost. It's in the love that persists, even as memories fade. But every story has a turning point. And one night, as you sit by their bedside, you notice something different. Their breathing is softer, their eyes heavier. They look at you with a rare clarity, a moment of recognition that feels like a miracle. And then, just as quickly, it's gone. You realize then that this journey isn't just about them, it's about you, too. It's about learning to let go while holding on. It's about finding strength in the face of unimaginable loss. And most of all, it's about love. The kind of love that doesn't give up, even when it hurts. As the days go on, you know the road ahead won't get easier. There will be more moments of confusion, more days when the weight of it all feels unbearable. But you also know that every moment matters. Every laugh, every tear, every shared memory is a gift. And so you hold on to hope. Not the hope that things will go back to the way they were, but the hope that you'll find joy in the little things, the sound of their laughter, the warmth of their hand in yours, the love that remains even when everything else fades away. Because in the end, that's what truly matters. Not the memories they've lost, but the love you'll always carry for them. And as you sit beside them, watching the sun set on another day, you remind yourself that even in the darkest moments, love is the light that never fades. It's strange how quickly life changes when you're thrust into a situation you never thought you'd face. The past feels like a distant memory, a time when things were normal, when you didn't have to think twice about leaving the house or staying up all night to make sure everything was okay. Before Alzheimer's, life had its challenges, sure, but they felt manageable. Predictable. Now, every day feels like stepping into the unknown. It hadn't always been this way. There was a time when they were strong, capable, and full of life. You still remember how their laughter could fill a room, how their advice could solve any problem, how their hugs could make the world feel safe. They were the rock of the family, the person everyone turned to in times of need. It's hard to reconcile that image with the person they've become, the fragile, confused soul who now depends on you for everything. The signs had been there, of course, but hindsight is always clearer. You remember the day they forgot your birthday, the first time in your entire life they hadn't called or sent a card. At the time, you brushed it off, thinking they were just busy or distracted. But then there were other moments. Like when they got lost driving home from the grocery store, a route they'd taken for years. Or when they started repeating the same questions over and over, not realizing they'd already asked. The diagnosis came after months of uncertainty, months of hoping it was something else, something easier to fix. But when the doctor sat you down and said the word Alzheimer's, it felt like the ground had been pulled out from under you. You didn't fully understand what it meant at the time. You just knew it wasn't good. The early days were the hardest in some ways, not because of what was happening, but because of what was to come. You didn't know how bad it would get, but you knew it wouldn't be easy. They tried to act like everything was fine, tried to joke about their forgetfulness, but you could see the fear in their eyes. They knew, even if they didn't say it out loud. You started reading everything you could about Alzheimer's, trying to prepare yourself, trying to figure out how to help. But no amount of research could truly prepare you for the reality. It's one thing to read about memory loss, mood swings, and confusion. It's another thing entirely to live it. To watch someone you love struggle to remember their own name. To see them grow frustrated and angry over things they can't control. To feel helpless as the disease takes more and more of them away. And then there were the practical challenges. Doctor's appointments, medications, safety precautions. It was overwhelming. You found yourself constantly on edge, constantly second-guessing your decisions. Were you doing enough? Were you doing it right? The guilt was always there, a heavy weight you couldn't shake. But through it all, there were still moments of connection. Moments that reminded you of who they used to be. Like when they'd smile at you with that same warmth you remembered from your childhood. or when they'd hum a tune from an old song, even if they couldn't remember the words. Those moments became your lifeline, the thing that kept you going when everything else felt too hard. You started noticing patterns in their behavior, little routines that seemed to bring them comfort. Like how they always wanted to sit by the window in the late afternoon, watching the sunlight filter through the trees. Or how they'd hold on to a favorite blanket, running their fingers over the fabric as if it grounded them. These small things became your focus, your way of giving them a sense of stability in a world that was slipping away. But even with those routines, there were days that tested you in ways you didn't think possible. Like the day they didn't recognize their own reflection in the mirror and became terrified, thinking a stranger had entered the house. Or the time they accused you of stealing from them, their voice filled with anger and distrust. It wasn't their fault, you knew that, but it still hurt. It cut deeper than you wanted to admit. The isolation was another challenge. Friends and family meant well, but most didn't understand what you were going through. They'd offer words of encouragement or promises to help, but as time went on, those offers became less frequent. People didn't know what to say or how to act, so they stayed away. And while you couldn't blame them, it left you feeling more alone than ever. Nights were the hardest. That was when the house felt the quietest, when the weight of everything pressed down on you the most. You'd lie awake, listening for any sound, ready to get up at a moment's notice if they needed you. Sleep became a luxury, something you could only dream about. There were times when you questioned yourself, questioned everything. Were you strong enough to do this? Could you handle the months or even years ahead? The thought of losing them entirely was unbearable, but so was the thought of watching them fade away bit by bit. It felt like an impossible choice, one you didn't have the luxury of making. You found small ways to cope, though. Little acts of self-care that helped you get through the day. A quiet cup of tea in the morning before they woke up. A few stolen moments to read or watch a show after they'd gone to bed. These small rituals became your anchor, your reminder that you were still a person outside of your role as a caregiver. And then there were the memories. The good ones, the ones you held onto like a lifeline. You'd think back to the times before Alzheimer's, to family vacations, holiday dinners, and quiet evenings spent talking about nothing and everything. Those memories became your refuge, your reminder of why you were doing this. But no matter how hard you tried to focus on the positive, there was always an undercurrent of fear. Fear of what the future would bring. Fear of the moment when they wouldn't recognize you at all. Fear of losing yourself in the process of caring for them. One evening, as you sat by their bedside, you found yourself thinking about the past again. You thought about the sacrifices they'd made for you, the way they'd always put your needs ahead of their own. You thought about the times they'd stayed up late helping you with school projects, the way they'd cheer the loudest at your games or performances, the way their love had always been a constant in your life. And in that moment, you realized something important. As hard as this journey was, it was also a gift. A chance to give back to someone who had given you so much. A chance to show them the same unconditional love they'd shown you. It didn't make the pain go away, but it gave you a sense of purpose, a reason to keep going even on the hardest days. Still, the challenges didn't go away. If anything, they grew more intense as time went on. The disease was relentless, taking more and more from them each day. And yet, through it all, there was still love. Still moments of connection, however fleeting. You started to see beauty in the small things, in the quiet moments that might have gone unnoticed before. Like the way they'd smile when they heard a familiar song. Or the way they'd relax when you held their hand. These moments reminded you that even in the midst of heartbreak, there was still joy to be found. But as much as you tried to focus on the present, the future loomed like a shadow. You didn't know how much time you had left, didn't know what the next days or weeks would bring. All you could do was take it one day at a time, one moment at a time, holding on to the love that had always been the foundation of your relationship. And so you kept going. Through the tears, the frustration, and the heartbreak, you kept going. Because no matter how hard it got, you knew one thing for certain: they were worth it. Every single moment was worth it. The days were beginning to blur together, each one feeling like a cycle of endless repetition. Wake up, care for them, guide them through routines that no longer felt familiar to them, and then brace yourself for the unpredictable moments that could strike at any time. Sometimes it was the little things: a misplaced item or a forgotten word. Other times, it was the overwhelming sadness of watching their frustration as they struggled to hold on to what was slipping away. But something had shifted recently, something subtle at first. Their moments of confusion were lasting longer. Their silences, once sporadic, now stretched across hours. The questions they asked were becoming more fragmented, more distant, as though their mind was reaching out for memories that no longer existed. You tried to brush it off, telling yourself this was just a phase, but deep down, you knew it wasn't. One evening, after what had been an unusually quiet day, you found them sitting in the living room, staring at the wall. The television was on, but they weren't watching it. Their hands rested in their lap, fingers lightly trembling, as though their body was mirroring the unease in their mind. You approached gently, careful not to startle them, and asked if they were all right. They turned to you slowly, their expression blank at first. Then, for just a fleeting second, you thought you saw recognition in their eyes, a small glimmer of the person you remembered. But then they said something that stopped you cold. "I'm waiting for them to come home," they murmured, their voice barely above a whisper. You froze, unsure how to respond. "Who?" you asked, trying to keep your tone calm. "The kids," they said, looking at you with a seriousness that sent a chill down your spine. "They should have been back by now." Your heart broke as you realized they were talking about a time long past, back when their children were young, back when life was simpler. You wanted to tell them that everything was okay, that the kids they were waiting for had grown up and gone on to live their lives. But the words caught in your throat. Would telling the truth bring comfort, or would it only deepen their confusion? Before you could answer, they stood up suddenly, their movements unsteady. "I need to go look for them," they said, their voice trembling. With urgency, you gently placed a hand on their arm, trying to ground them. "It's all right," you said softly. "They're safe. You don't need to worry." But they pulled away, their fear and determination growing. "No," they said firmly. "Something's wrong. I have to find them." It took everything in you to calm them down, to guide them back to the couch and reassure them that everything was fine. But the panic in their eyes lingered, even as they began to settle. You stayed with them long after they fell asleep, your mind racing with thoughts of what might happen if they ever acted on that fear when you weren't around. The next day, you called the doctor, desperate for guidance. You explained the growing confusion, the moments of panic, the episodes where they seemed to drift farther away from reality. The doctor's response was measured, clinical, but it didn't ease the ache in your chest. They explained that this was a natural progression of the disease, that these moments would become more frequent as time went on. They recommended safety measures: locks on doors, alarms, anything to ensure they couldn't wander off. You nodded, took notes, and promised yourself you'd do everything you could to keep them safe. But as you hung up the phone, you couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how much you prepared, it would never be enough. The following weeks were some of the hardest you'd faced. The episodes came more frequently now, each one more intense than the last. There were days when they didn't recognize you at all, days when they mistook you for someone else entirely. And then there were the nights-long, restless nights when they'd wake up in a panic, convinced they were in the wrong house or that someone was trying to hurt them. You did your best to stay calm, to soothe them with gentle words and reminders of who you were. But inside you were unraveling. The fear, the exhaustion, the heartbreak, it was all becoming too much. You found yourself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much longer you could keep going. And then, one night, everything came to a head. It started as a normal evening, or as normal as things could be these days. You'd made dinner, helped them into their favorite chair, and put on one of their favorite old movies. For a while, everything seemed calm. They even laughed at a scene they must have watched 100 times before. But as the night went on, something shifted. They grew restless, their movements fidgety, their gaze darting around the room as though they were searching for something. You asked if they were okay, but they didn't respond. Instead, they stood up abruptly and started walking toward the front door. "Where are you going?" you asked, your voice laced with concern. "I need to leave," they said, their tone distant and flat. You moved quickly, stepping in front of them to block their path. "It's late," you said gently. "Let's sit back down, okay?" But they didn't stop. Their eyes were fixed on the door, their expression a mixture of determination and fear. "I have to go," they said, their voice rising. "I have to get out of here." Panic surged through you as you realized this wasn't like the other episodes. There was a desperation in their voice, a kind of urgency you hadn't seen before. You tried to reason with them, to calm them down, but nothing seemed to work. They were convinced they needed to leave, and nothing you said could change their mind. In a moment of desperation, you gently grabbed their shoulders, forcing them to look at you. "You're safe," you said firmly, trying to keep your voice steady. "You don't need to go anywhere." For a brief second, they paused. Their eyes met yours, and you hoped, that they might recognize you. But then they pulled away, their movements frantic. "Let me go!" they shouted, their voice filled with fear. The sound of their voice, the raw panic in it, shook you to your core. You didn't know what to do, didn't know how to bring them back from wherever their mind had taken them. All you could do was stand there, helpless, as they backed away, their breathing heavy, their eyes wild. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. They sank down into a chair, their body trembling, their face buried in their hands. You rushed to their side, your heart pounding, unsure if they were okay. "I don't know what's happening," they whispered, their voice breaking. "I'm so scared." You knelt beside them, your own tears threatening to spill over. "I'm here," you said softly, your voice trembling. "I won't let anything happen to you." But even as you said the words, a part of you couldn't shake the fear that this was only the beginning. Something had changed that night, something you couldn't ignore. The disease was progressing, and no matter how hard you tried, you couldn't stop it. And now, as you sat beside them, holding their hand and watching the fear slowly fade from their eyes, you couldn't help but wonder, how much longer could you keep them safe? How much longer could you hold on before everything slipped away? The tension in the air was palpable, the weight of everything pressing down on you like never before. And as the clock ticked on, you realized that the hardest moments were yet to come. The days after that harrowing night were quieter, but not in a way that brought comfort. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel like something was brewing just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to explode. You tried to push through the heaviness, keeping the routines as normal as possible, but the unease lingered like a shadow. They seemed calmer for a time, almost as though they had forgotten the fear that had overtaken them. But you couldn't forget. Every time they left the room, you found yourself instinctively following, just to make sure they weren't trying to leave or doing something that could harm them. The doctor's warnings echoed in your mind: locks, alarms, safety measures. You had done everything you could think of to secure the house, but deep down, you knew that safety wasn't just about locked doors. It was about the unpredictable nature of what was happening to them, a battle you couldn't fight or control. Then came the first twist, one you hadn't anticipated. It happened on a crisp morning, sunlight streaming through the windows as you prepared breakfast. They had been unusually quiet again, staring out of the kitchen window as though lost in thought. You were grateful for the moment of peace, though a part of you worried about what was going on in their mind. "I had a dream last night," they said suddenly, their voice startling you. You turned to look at them, surprised. Dreams weren't something they had mentioned in a long time, and you weren't sure what to expect. "What kind of dream?" you asked gently, trying not to sound too eager. Their eyes stayed fixed on the window, their face expressionless. "It was about them," they said softly, their tone distant. "The kids." They were calling me. They needed me. You felt a knot tighten in your chest. This wasn't the first time they had mentioned hearing voices or feeling like someone was calling them, but there was something about the way they said it now that felt different. It's just a dream, you said, your voice calm but firm. Dreams can feel real sometimes, but they're not. You're safe here. They didn't respond right away. Their gaze remained steady, their hands resting on the table, trembling slightly. Then they turned to you, and the look in their eyes sent a chill down your spine. It wasn't confusion or fear this time. It was something else, something that felt almost like certainty. They're waiting for me, they said, their voice steady and calm, as though stating a simple fact. You froze, unsure of how to respond. Who's waiting? You asked carefully, not wanting to upset them. The kids, they said again. I have to go to them. I don't know why I didn't realize it before. You tried to keep your composure, but the weight of their words felt like it might crush you. You had read about this, how some people with Alzheimer's fixated on certain ideas, convinced they were real. But this felt different, more urgent. They're not waiting, you said gently. They're okay. They're grown now, remember? You don't need to go anywhere. But they shook their head, their expression firm. You don't understand, they said, their voice rising slightly. They need me. I can't just sit here. You spent the rest of the morning trying to calm them down, reassuring them over and over that everything was fine. But the look in their eyes never changed, and it left you feeling more unsettled than ever. And then the second twist came, hitting you like a freight train. It was late in the evening, long after you had finally gotten them to settle down. You had just finished cleaning up the kitchen when you noticed something strange. One of the windows in the living room was unlocked. You could have sworn you had checked it earlier, but now it was slightly ajar, letting in a faint breeze. Your heart sank as you moved to close it. You told yourself it was nothing, that maybe you had just forgotten to lock it. But the uneasy feeling in your chest wouldn't go away. The next morning, you woke up earlier than usual, your body still on edge from the night before. You went to check on them, expecting to find them still in bed. But when you opened their door, the bed was empty. Panic surged through you as you searched the house, calling their name over and over. The fear you had been carrying for weeks, months, now hit you full force. They were gone. You ran outside, scanning the yard, the street, every possible place they could have gone. Your mind raced with worst-case scenarios, images of them wandering into traffic or getting lost in the cold. You called the neighbors, hoping someone had seen them, but no one had. As the minutes turned into hours, your fear turned to desperation. You called the police, explaining the situation through shaky breaths. They assured you they would do everything they could, but their words felt hollow. And then, just as the sun began to set, you got the call. Someone had found them, wandering miles from home, dazed and confused. Relief washed over you as you drove to pick them up, but when you saw them sitting in the back of the patrol car, something inside you broke. They looked at you with tired, empty eyes, their expression blank. For a moment, you thought they might not even recognize you. But then they smiled faintly, and you saw a flicker of the person they used to be. I was trying to find them, they said quietly, their voice shaky. I thought I knew the way, but I got lost. You didn't know what to say. The emotions swirling inside you were too much to process: relief, anger, fear, heartbreak. All you could do was take their hand and lead them back to the car, promising yourself that you would find a way to keep them safe, no matter what. But as you drove home, the unease lingered. Something about their words stuck with you, a nagging feeling you couldn't shake. They had been so certain, so determined. And for the first time, you found yourself wondering if this wasn't just a disease. If maybe, somehow, there was something more to it. The tension was unbearable now, the weight of everything pressing down on you like never before. And as you pulled into the driveway, you couldn't help but feel like this was far from over. The real storm was just beginning. The days following the incident were heavy with a sense of dread you couldn't shake. Even though they were home again, the fear of them wandering off kept you constantly on edge. You double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, installed additional alarms, and even placed small motion detectors in the hallways. Despite all of this, there was a feeling you couldn't escape, a lingering thought that no amount of preparation could truly keep them or you safe from what was happening. They seemed calmer, almost subdued, but it wasn't the kind of calm that brought peace. It was more like the eye of a storm, quiet and still, but with chaos brewing just beyond the horizon. Their gaze often drifted off, as if they were looking at something you couldn't see, and their words became more cryptic. They stopped talking about the kids, but now they whispered about a door. At first, you thought it was just another fragment of a dream or memory, but the way they described it was eerily vivid. "You don't see it, do you?" they said one night, their voice barely above a whisper. "It's right there. They're waiting behind it." You tried to respond calmly, reminding them there was no door, that they were safe and everything was fine. But deep down, you couldn't ignore the growing unease. The way they spoke, with such certainty, made you feel like maybe you were the one who wasn't seeing something. That night you barely slept. You stayed up, listening to the faint creaks and shifts of the house, every sound amplified by the quiet. When you finally dozed off, it felt like only minutes before you were jolted awake by the piercing sound of one of the alarms. Heart racing, you bolted out of bed and ran to their room, only to find it empty again. The door to the backyard was wide open. You ran outside, your feet bare against the cold ground, scanning the darkness for any sign of them. The night air was sharp, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. You called their name over and over, your voice cracking with panic. And then, just as you were about to call for help, you saw them standing at the edge of the yard, staring at something in the distance that you approached cautiously, your heart pounding. "What are you doing out here?" you asked, trying to keep your voice steady. "Come back inside. It's not safe." They didn't move. Their eyes stayed fixed on the woods beyond the yard, and when they finally spoke, their voice was calm but distant. "It's here. The door. Can't you feel it?" You shivered, whether from the cold or their words, you weren't sure. "There's nothing there," you said firmly. "Please, let's go back inside." They turned to look at you then, their expression a mixture of sadness and something else you couldn't quite place. "You don't understand," they said softly. "I have to go. They need me." Before you could react, they started walking toward the woods. You grabbed their arm, your voice rising with desperation. "No! You can't go. Please come back with me." For a moment, it felt like they might listen. They hesitated, their eyes meeting yours, and you saw a flicker of recognition of the person you remembered. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. They pulled away, their gaze drifting back toward the woods. "I'm sorry," they whispered. "I have to." And then they were gone, disappearing into the darkness before you could stop them. You stood there, frozen, torn between chasing after them and the overwhelming fear that you were too late. Finally, your legs moved on their own, carrying you into the trees, the shadows swallowing you whole. The woods were eerily silent, every step you took crunching loudly against the leaves and twigs below. You called their name, your voice trembling, but there was no response. Panic gripped you as you pushed forward, your mind racing with images of them lost, hurt, or worse. And then, just as you were about to give up, you saw a faint light glowing through the trees. You stumbled toward it, your breath catching in your throat. As you got closer, the light grew brighter, almost blinding. And then you saw them, standing in the center of the clearing, bathed in the strange, ethereal glow. Their face was calm, peaceful even, and for a moment, you almost didn't recognize them. "What are you doing?" you cried, your voice breaking. "Please come back." They turned to you, and their expression was different, soft, almost serene. "I found it," they said simply. "The door." You shook your head, tears streaming down your face. There's no door. This isn't real. Please, just come back with me. But they only smiled, a sad, knowing smile that broke your heart. You can't stop it, they said gently. It's time. And then, before you could say anything else, the light intensified, swallowing everything around you. You threw your hands up to shield your eyes, but the brightness was overwhelming. When it finally dimmed, they were gone. The clearing was empty, the light extinguished, leaving you alone in the dark. You searched the woods for hours, calling their name until your voice gave out. By the time the sun began to rise, you knew the truth: they were gone. And yet, as you made your way back to the house, a strange sense of calm settled over you. It didn't make sense, and you couldn't explain it, but for the first time in months, you felt like they were at peace. In the days that followed, you replayed the events over and over in your mind, searching for answers. You told yourself it was the disease, that their mind had created something you couldn't understand. But deep down, a part of you couldn't shake the feeling that maybe they had found something you weren't meant to see. And then, weeks later, you found it. Tucked away in a drawer you rarely opened was a small notebook filled with their handwriting, messy but still legible. Page after page, they had written about the door, about the voices calling to them, about the feeling that something was waiting just beyond the veil. And on the final page, scrawled in shaky letters, were the words that sent a chill down your spine: "Don't be afraid. When it's your time, you'll see it too." You closed the notebook, your hands trembling, and stared out the window. The yard was quiet, the woods still. But somewhere deep inside, you felt it, the faintest pull, like a whisper on the edge of your mind. In the days after finding the notebook, life seemed to move forward, but it felt different, quieter, emptier, and weighed down by unanswered questions. You kept it with you, tucked away in a drawer like a secret, unsure whether to share it or let it fade away like a dream you were afraid to forget. The house, once filled with their presence, now felt hollow. Even though the routines remained the same: locking the doors, turning off the lights, walking through the hallways, you couldn't shake the sense that something was missing, something intangible but vital. People came by, offering condolences and sharing kind words about how deeply they had cared for their family. Neighbors brought food, friends called to check in, but none of it filled the void. Some of them asked how it had happened, how someone could just disappear like that, and you found yourself repeating the same explanation. They had wandered off, you said, probably confused, and despite all your efforts, they were lost to the night. It was an answer that satisfied others, but not you. When the search teams were called off and the authorities stopped calling, the silence grew louder. But it wasn't just grief, it was that feeling, the pull that had started faint and was now undeniable. You tried to convince yourself it wasn't real, that it was just your mind playing tricks in the wake of loss. But as time passed, it became harder to ignore. Every time you stepped into the backyard or glanced at the woods, you felt it, like an invisible thread tugging at your chest. You avoided the clearing for as long as you could. Weeks passed, then months, and life began to settle into something resembling normalcy. But the notebook lingered in your thoughts, its cryptic words stirring something you couldn't name. And late one night, when the house was quiet and the restlessness wouldn't let you sleep, you found yourself standing at the edge of the yard again, staring into the darkness. The air felt different that night, heavier, charged, like the moments before a storm. You told yourself you were just going for a walk, that there was no harm in stepping into the trees. But deep down, you knew you were searching for something. You didn't call their name this time. Instead, you moved silently, letting your instincts guide you, as if some part of you already knew the way. When you reached the clearing, your breath caught in your throat. It was just as you remembered it, empty and still, but there was something different, an energy you couldn't explain, as though the ground itself was humming with a quiet, unspoken truth. You stood there for a long time, waiting for something to happen, but the woods remained silent. And yet, in that silence, you felt a strange sense of peace. In the weeks that followed, you began to let go of the fear. The notebook stayed in its drawer, and the pull that had once felt overwhelming softened into something gentler, like a quiet reminder that you weren't alone. You began to reflect on the time you'd spent caring for them, on the sacrifices and the heartbreak, but also the moments of joy, however fleeting. You remembered their smile, their laughter, the way their eyes lit up when they spoke about the past. And you realized that even in their final moments, they had given you something, a sense of wonder, of possibility, of connection to something larger than yourself. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Life moved forward, as it always does, but you carried their memory with you, not as a burden, but as a gift. You found yourself drawn to the little things, the way the sunlight filtered through the trees, the sound of the wind rustling the leaves, the simple act of being present in the world. And though you didn't have all the answers, you realized that maybe you didn't need them. Some mysteries, you thought, weren't meant to be solved. They were meant to be felt, to remind us of what it means to be human. One afternoon, as you sat in the backyard, you noticed something you hadn't seen before, a small patch of wildflowers growing at the edge of the woods. They were delicate and vibrant, swaying gently in the breeze, and for a moment you thought you saw something else, a flicker of movement, a shadow that disappeared as quickly as it came. You smiled, a bittersweet smile that carried both loss and hope, and for the first time in a long time, you felt at peace. Years later, when people asked about them, you would tell their story, not just the sadness of it, but the beauty, too. You would talk about the love you shared, the lessons they taught you, and the way they reminded you to look for the light, even in the darkest moments. And though the pain of losing them never truly went away, it became a part of you, a thread woven into the fabric of your life. In the end, you realized that caring for someone with Alzheimer's wasn't just about the heartbreak of watching them fade, it was about learning to see them as they were, in all their complexity, and holding on to that even as the disease tried to take it away. It was about finding meaning in the chaos, love in the midst of loss, and hope in the face of uncertainty. As you sat in the backyard one evening, watching the sun set behind the trees, you felt the pull again, faint but unmistakable. You closed your eyes and let it wash over you, not with fear, but with gratitude. Because even though they were gone, they had left you with something far greater than answers. They had left you with the courage to keep going, the strength to face the unknown, and the reminder that love, in all its forms, is what connects us to each other, to the world, and to the mysteries that lie just beyond the veil.